You know, honey, at 82 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of family betrayal there was to see. Lord knows I've counseled enough teenagers through their dramatic heartbreaks during my 43 years as principal at Savannah High School. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the day I realized my own daughter-in-law had decided I was too old to matter. My name is Evelyn Harper, and I've lived in the same Victorian house on Jones Street in Savannah's historic district since 1962. That's when my dear husband Charles and I bought it with our wedding gift money and a prayer. Charles passed on to glory 15 years ago, but this house still holds every memory we made together, every Sunday dinner with our boys, every Christmas morning filled with grandchildren's laughter. I've always prided myself on being the kind of woman who shows up. When my eldest son Michael needed money for college, I took on evening tutoring sessions for 3 years straight. When my younger boy David wanted to open his first business, Charles and I mortgaged this very house to help him. And when David married Candace 12 years ago, I welcomed that girl with open arms, even helped her start that fancy boutique of hers on Bull Street, with what most folks would consider a generous loan. Candace always seemed grateful back then, called me Mama Evelyn in that sweet voice of hers, brought me flowers from her shop every Sunday, asked my advice about everything from window displays to handling difficult customers. I taught her how to make my famous peach cobbler, shared my grandmother's secret for keeping fresh flowers lasting longer, even introduced her to half the society ladies in Savannah who became her best customers. So when her younger sister Bethany got engaged to that Charleston lawyer last spring, I naturally assumed I'd be part of the celebration. The Harper family has always been present for life's big moments. I've attended 47 weddings in my lifetime, from simple church ceremonies to elaborate affairs at the Mercer House. I've given advice to nervous brides, held crying mothers, and even stepped in to handle last-minute disasters with the calm authority that comes from decades of managing teenage crises. But as April turned into May, and May blossomed into June, no ivory envelope appeared in my mailbox. I told myself there was surely some explanation. Perhaps the invitations were delayed. Or maybe there was some mix-up at the post office. Mrs. Patterson down at the Savannah Morning News Society desk had mentioned seeing engagement announcements, and even my bridge partner, Margaret, asked if I was excited about the upcoming celebration. The first real sting came during our monthly family dinner at David and Candace's house on Forsyth Park. I'd brought my contribution, a pineapple upside-down cake that's been the family favorite since the boys were knee-high to a grasshopper. The conversation flowed easily until I asked Candace about wedding plans, expecting to offer my help with arrangements, or perhaps share some wisdom from my years of attending Savannah's finest social events. The silence that followed could have cut glass. David suddenly became very interested in his plate of fried chicken, and Candace's smile turned tight around the edges. "Oh, Mama Evelyn," she said, in that tone I'd heard her use with difficult customers, "it's going to be such a small, intimate affair. Really more of a young people's gathering, you know." I smiled and nodded, but something cold settled in my chest. Young people's gathering. At my age, you learn to read between the lines, and those lines were spelling out a message I didn't want to accept. The truth hit me like a slap. 2 weeks later, I'd stopped by their house unannounced, something I rarely do, but I'd been at Forsyth Park for my morning constitutional, and remembered I'd left my reading glasses there the Sunday before. I let myself in through the kitchen door, as family always did, and heard voices from the living room. Candace was on the phone, and David was sitting nearby. I was about to call out when I heard her say, "No, we definitely can't invite his grandmother. She's just too old, Beth. She'll slow everything down, probably need special accommodations, and honestly, she won't understand the vibe we're going for. You know how these elderly people get at weddings, always complaining about the music being too loud or needing to sit down every 5 minutes." I stood there in that kitchen, my hand still on the doorknob, feeling like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it couldn't beat properly. David, my own son, the boy I'd rocked through countless nightmares and cheered through every baseball game, just sat there nodding along. Elderly people, as if I were some doddering old fool instead of the woman who'd helped build half the connections that made their comfortable life possible. As if I hadn't spent the better part of a decade helping establish Candace in Savannah society, introducing her to the right people, vouching for her character when she was still just some girl David had met at a conference in Atlanta. I slipped back out that kitchen door quieter than a church mouse, my reading glasses forgotten. But something else had awakened in me during those few minutes of eavesdropping, something I hadn't felt since the day I caught Tommy Henderson trying to cheat on his final exam back in 1978. It was the particular kind of clarity that comes when someone underestimates you so completely that they forget who they're dealing with. That afternoon, I sat in my garden with a glass of sweet tea, looking at the camellias Charles had planted for our 20th anniversary. A memory surfaced from my teaching days, something I used to tell my students when they faced bullies. The most dangerous opponent is the one who lets you think you're winning while they're planning their real move. By sunset, I was smiling for the first time in weeks. Not the polite, grandmotherly smile I'd been wearing like a mask, but the smile I used to wear when I'd figured out exactly how to handle a particularly challenging situation. Candace and David thought they knew Evelyn Harper, the sweet, accommodating grandmother who baked cookies and minded her own business. They were about to discover they'd never really met me at all. The hardest part about being dismissed isn't the initial hurt, it's having to smile through the daily reminders that you don't matter anymore. Every morning for the next 3 weeks, I woke up to a new small humiliation, each one designed to remind me of my place in this family's hierarchy. Candace's Instagram feed became a daily exhibition of wedding preparations. Photos of her and Bethany trying on dresses at that expensive boutique in Charleston, pictures of cake tastings at Leopold's Ice Cream, videos of flower arrangements being planned at Bloom's on Broughton. Each post had dozens of comments from family and friends I'd known for decades, all gushing with excitement about the upcoming celebration. The most twisted part was watching people I'd helped over the years, former students, neighbors I'd supported through difficult times, church members I'd counseled, all commenting on these posts as if they didn't know I existed. Sarah Mitchell, whose daughter I'd helped get into college when her grades were slipping, wrote "Can't wait to celebrate with the family." Margaret Holbrook, who'd borrowed money from me when her husband lost his job, posted heart emojis under every single photo. But it was my dear friend Marlene who finally made me realize just how calculated this exclusion really was. We've been friends since 1963, when we both started teaching in the same school district. She's 80 now, sharp as a tack, and has been like a sister to me since Charles passed. When she called me on a Tuesday morning, her voice was tight with controlled anger. "Evelyn, honey, I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. Are you not talking about Bethany's wedding because you're trying to be modest? Or because you weren't invited either?" The silence stretched between us like a bridge. Neither of us wanted to cross. "Finally," I whispered. "What did you hear, Marlene?" "I heard that they decided the guest list was getting too long, so they cut out what Candace called the old crowd. That's you and me, honey. 60 years of friendship with this family. And we're the old crowd." We sat on that phone line for a full minute, neither of us speaking. Two women who'd buried husbands, raised children, taught hundreds of students, volunteered at countless charity events, and contributed more to this community than most people do in 3 lifetimes, reduced to the old crowd. The breaking point came the following Sunday at family dinner. I'd considered not going, but that would have given Candace exactly what she wanted, my graceful exit from family life. Instead, I arrived with my usual contribution, this time my famous bourbon chicken that had been a family favorite for 30 years. David and Candace were showing off wedding favors, little boxes of pralines from River Street Sweets that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. Candace held one up like it was made of spun gold. "These are for the reception tables." Bethany wanted something authentically Southern, and I told her nobody does pralines like River Street. I bit back the urge to mention that I'd been making pralines since before Candace was born, using my grandmother's recipe that River Street would probably pay good money to learn. Instead, I smiled and said, "How thoughtful, I'm sure your guests will love them." That's when Candace made her mistake. She laughed. Not the polite laugh you give your elders, but the patronizing giggle reserved for people you consider beneath notice. "Oh, Mama Evelyn, you're so sweet. But you probably wouldn't understand what we're going for with this wedding. It's got a very specific aesthetic. Modern Southern elegance meets contemporary sophistication. Not really the traditional church and reception style your generation is used to." My generation, as if I were some relic from the Civil War instead of a woman who'd attended more elegant events than Candace could imagine. As if I hadn't been navigating Savannah society since she was still figuring out which fork to use for salad. But I smiled. Lord help me. I smiled and nodded and complimented their beautiful plans. Because in that moment, sitting at my son's dinner table, I remembered something my dear Charles used to say when dealing with difficult parents during PTA meetings. Let them talk, Evie. The more they reveal about their true nature, the better you'll understand how to handle them. After dinner, I helped clear the table as I always did, listening to David and Candace discuss final preparations. The wedding would be at the mansion on Forsyth Park, with a reception at the Morris Center. The flowers alone would cost more than most people's cars. The photography package included a videographer from Atlanta. They'd hired a string quartet for the ceremony and a jazz band for the reception. As I loaded the dishwasher, something clicked in my mind like the tumbler of an old lock finally finding its position. All of this elaborate planning, all of these expensive vendors, all of this modern Southern elegance, it was being funded by someone. And given that David's income as a regional sales manager was comfortable, but hardly extravagant, I had a pretty good idea where the real money was coming from. That night, I sat in Charles's old study with a legal pad and pen, writing down everything I remembered about the loans I'd made, the investments I'd quietly funded, the connections I'd provided over the years. The picture that emerged was fascinating. Candace's boutique had been struggling before I'd stepped in with capital and customers. David's house had required a cosigner when they'd applied for their mortgage. Even their cars had been purchased with loans I'd guaranteed. But the most interesting discovery was a phone call I made to my attorney, Robert Kane. Bobby had been one of my debate team students back in 1987, a quiet boy with a sharp mind who'd gone on to become one of Savannah's most respected lawyers. He'd handled Charles's will, managed our estate planning, and had always treated me with the respect due someone who'd helped shape his future. "Mrs. Harper," he said, when I called his office the next morning, "what a lovely surprise. How can I help you today?" "Bobby, I need to review some financial documents. Specifically, I want to understand my options regarding certain investments and guarantees I've made over the years." There was a pause. Bobby had always been quick to read between lines. "Of course. Would you prefer to discuss this over lunch? I'm free Thursday if you'd like to meet at the old pink house." After I hung up, I opened the small leather notebook I'd started keeping by my bedside. On the first page, I wrote wedding preparations and the date. Below that, I added, "They think they know me. They're about to learn otherwise." The next morning brought another Instagram post from Candace, a photo of bridesmaids' dresses with the caption, "Getting so close. Can't wait to celebrate with our nearest and dearest." 43 comments of excitement from people I'd known for decades. I liked the post and added my own comment, "Such beautiful dresses. Wishing you all the best for your special day." Because if there's one thing 43 years of handling teenagers taught me, it's that the sweetest smile often hides the sharpest teeth. Thursday lunch, with Bobby Kane at the old pink house, revealed information that made me understand just how much power I'd forgotten I possessed. Sitting in that historic dining room where I'd celebrated countless special occasions over the decades, I learned that my late husband's careful estate planning had left me with far more influence than anyone, including myself, had realized. "Mrs. Harper," Bobby said, spreading documents across the white tablecloth between our shrimp and grits, "I think you may have lost track of exactly how your financial portfolio is structured. Charles was quite strategic in how he set up your trusts and investments." The papers told a story I'd somehow forgotten in my grief and my focus on being the accommodating grandmother. The Harper Family Trust, established in 1985, held significant investments in several local businesses. Most interesting was a 40% stake in the building that housed Candace's boutique, an investment Charles had made when downtown Savannah was still recovering from urban decay, long before the historic district became the fashionable shopping destination it is today. "So if I understand correctly," I said, keeping my voice calm despite the excitement building in my chest, "I'm essentially Candace's landlord?" Bobby nodded. "The lease runs through a property management company, so she may not even realize the connection. But yes, her rent payments ultimately flow through to your trust account. And according to the terms Charles negotiated, you have the right to make decisions about lease renewals, rent adjustments, and tenant suitability." But that wasn't all. Charles had also quietly invested in a small lending business that provided capital to local entrepreneurs, the very business that had provided Candace's startup funding 8 years ago. Again, Layers of financial managers had obscured the connection, but the paper trail was clear. How much of her business operations depend on these connections? I asked. Bobby pulled out his calculator. Between the building lease, the original startup loan that's still being paid down, and a business line of credit she opened 2 years ago during the pandemic, I'd say roughly 70% of her overhead costs flow back to entities you control or influence. I sipped my sweet tea and considered this information. Candace had built her success story on a foundation she didn't even know I'd provided. All those years of playing the proud grandmother, beaming when she talked about her self-made business, never mentioning that her success was largely possible because of Harper family investments. What would happen, I asked carefully, if I decided to restructure some of these arrangements? Well, that would depend on what you wanted to accomplish. The lease has a 6-month termination clause for owner use. The business loan can be called due if certain performance metrics aren't met, metrics that frankly require some creative interpretation. The line of credit comes up for renewal in September. Bobby leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same expression he'd worn as a teenager when he was working through a particularly complex debate argument. Mrs. Harper, may I ask what's prompted this sudden interest in your business holdings? I told him about the wedding exclusion, about being dismissed as too old, about the systematic effort to push Marlene and me out of family celebrations. Bobby's expression grew colder with each detail. I see, he said finally. And what outcome would you consider satisfactory? That evening, I sat in my garden with a fresh legal pad, this time writing down everything I'd learned about the wedding arrangements. A few phone calls to friends in the catering business, florist connections from my church work, and photographer recommendations I'd made over the years painted a picture of an event that was straining even generous budgets. Bethany and her fiancé were both young professionals, comfortable but not wealthy. David's contribution was limited. That left Candace as the primary financial backer of this elaborate celebration, the same Candace whose business cash flow depended entirely on arrangements she didn't know I controlled. My phone rang just as I was finishing my notes. It was Margaret from my bridge club, and her voice was tight with gossip, barely contained. Evelyn, honey, I just heard the most interesting thing at my hair appointment. Seems Candace was in there yesterday, talking about how expensive this wedding is getting. Apparently, some of her suppliers are demanding payment up front instead of offering the usual terms. Is that so? I murmured, though my heart was racing. And you know how Diane at the flower shop talks. She mentioned that Candace seemed surprised that her business credit line was being reviewed for renewal earlier than expected. Seemed to think there might be some mistake. There was no mistake. That afternoon, I'd asked Bobby to initiate standard reviews of all credit facilities connected to my trust investments. Perfectly legal, completely within my rights as an investor, and exactly the kind of financial pressure that would make an overextended business owner nervous. Well, I said to Margaret, I'm sure everything will work out just fine. After hanging up, I called my old friend Lila Brennan, who'd been running Savannah's premier floral design business since the Carter administration. We'd worked together on dozens of school events, charity fundraisers, and social occasions over the years. Lila, darling, how are you? I heard through the grapevine that you're doing flowers for a wedding at the mansion next month, the Morrison Williams celebration? Oh yes, Lila's voice warmed. Lovely event, though, I have to say. The coordinator seems a bit stressed about payment schedules. Nothing I can't handle, but you know how these elaborate weddings can get when budgets get tight. Of course. You know, Lila, given how long we've been friends, I hope you're protecting yourself properly on the business side, making sure payment terms are secure and all that. Actually, Evelyn, I was just thinking the same thing. Might be wise to move to a payment upfront policy for larger orders. You know how it is, friendship is one thing, but business is business. By the time I went to bed that night, I'd had similar conversations with 3 other vendors I'd recommended for the wedding, not suggesting they cancel anything. Of course, just encouraging them to protect their businesses with sound financial practices. I wrote one final entry in my notebook before turning out the light. They wanted to exclude me from their celebration. They're about to learn that excluding Evelyn Harper from anything in Savannah, Georgia, is a lot more complicated than they imagined. The next morning brought a phone call from David. For the first time in weeks, his voice carried a note of uncertainty. Mom, Have you heard anything about problems with wedding vendors? Candace is getting some strange calls about payment terms, and she's pretty stressed about it. I smiled as I watered my camellias. Oh, honey, you know how business can be sometimes. I'm sure it's nothing that can't be worked out with a little patience and careful planning. Right, of course. It's just, well, never mind. I'm sure you're right. As I hung up the phone, I realized I was humming. The first time I'd done that since overhearing that conversation in their kitchen. It was an old hymn Charles used to sing while shaving. How firm a foundation. Indeed, how firm a foundation, and how quickly it could shift when you forgot to acknowledge the bedrock it was built on. The beautiful thing about living in the same community for 60 years is that you stop being just a resident and become part of the infrastructure itself. Every connection leads to another, every favor banks goodwill for future needs, and every relationship builds layers of influence that younger people can't see until they're caught in the web of consequences. I spent the following week activating networks that I'd been building since the Eisenhower administration. It started with my Thursday morning volunteer shift at the Telfair Museum, where I'd been docent for over 20 years. My supervisor, Patricia Wells, had been one of my students back in 1974, a quiet girl who'd blossomed into confidence when I'd convinced her to join the debate team. "Mrs. Harper," Patricia said, as we arranged brochures in the visitor center, "didn't you mention your family has a wedding coming up? My cousin runs Morrison Entertainment. They're providing DJ services for quite a few summer weddings this season." I paused in my arranging, letting interest show on my face. Morrison Entertainment. The name sounds familiar. Tommy Morrison. He married Jenny Richardson. You remember Jenny? She was class of '92, always had that beautiful singing voice. Of course I remembered Jenny. Sweet girl, struggled with mathematics but had a gift for music that I'd encouraged by connecting her with the church choir director. Her wedding to Tommy had been a lovely affair in 2001, and I'd given them a generous gift when they'd started their entertainment business. You know, I should give Jenny a call. It's been far too long since we've caught up. That afternoon's phone call with Jenny was delightful. We discussed her children both doing wonderfully, her business thriving despite pandemic challenges, and eventually current bookings. "Actually, Mrs. Harper, we have your family's wedding on the schedule for next month, the Morrison Williams event at the mansion. Tommy's been looking forward to it. It sounds like a beautiful celebration." "Oh, how wonderful that you're part of it," I said warmly. "I do hope everything goes smoothly with the arrangements. You know how these elaborate events can be, so many moving pieces, so many opportunities for complications." "Well, we pride ourselves on reliability, though I have to say, we've learned over the years to be very careful about payment schedules. Can't afford to have equipment ready, and then find out there are financial hiccups at the last minute." "How wise of you. I imagine you require deposits well in advance?" "Usually yes, though for this particular event we were working on a partial payment plan. But you know, Mrs. Harper, after talking with you, I think I should probably give them a call about finalizing the balance before we commit to the date. Just good business practice." The next morning brought another opportunity during my grocery shopping at Publix on Habersham. I ran into Sandra Mitchell, whose husband James owned the catering company handling the wedding reception. Sandra and I had served together on the church fundraising committee for 5 years, working closely to organize events that had raised over $200,000 for various charitable causes. "Evelyn, how lovely to see you. James mentioned he's catering a wedding for your family next month. He's so excited. It sounds like quite an elegant affair." "Yes, the young people have certainly planned something special," I replied, selecting peaches with careful attention. "I just hope everything comes together smoothly for them. You know how stressful weddings can be when budgets get stretched too thin." Sandra's expression grew thoughtful. "James has been in this business for 15 years, and he's learned to be pretty careful about payment terms, especially for larger events where the food costs run into 5 figures. Very sensible. I'd hate to see any complications arise that might affect the quality of service. These young people deserve to have everything perfect for their special day." By Friday, I had similar conversations with the photographer whose assistant had been in my advanced English class in 1989, the rental company owner whose mother was in my bridge club, and even the string quartet coordinator, a former student whose wedding I'd attended in 2003. None of these conversations involved anything inappropriate. I never suggested anyone cancel services or create problems. I simply reconnected with old friends and former students, expressing natural concern about the business aspects of large events and encouraging the kind of careful financial planning that any responsible business owner should practice. The effects began showing up over the weekend. David called Saturday morning, his voice strained in a way I hadn't heard since his teenage years. "Mom, Candace is having some problems with wedding vendors. They're all suddenly demanding full payment up front instead of the payment plans they'd agreed to. It's like they coordinated or something." "Oh my," I said, settling into my porch swing with my morning coffee. "How strange. Though I suppose with the economy being uncertain, small businesses have to protect themselves. Have you considered that it might actually be a blessing in disguise? Better to have everything paid for in advance than worry about financial obligations during the actual celebration." "But Mom, the problem is cash flow. Candace's boutique has been a little tight lately, something about credit line reviews that she doesn't understand. She's having trouble coming up with that much cash all at once." "Credit line reviews? How unexpected. Though I suppose financial institutions have to be thorough these days. I'm sure it will all work out, honey. These things usually do." Sunday's family dinner was noticeably tense. Candace looked like she hadn't slept well, and David kept checking his phone as if expecting important calls. I arrived with my contribution, a lemon pound cake that had been a family favorite for decades, and settled in to observe the dynamics. "How are the wedding preparations coming along?" I asked pleasantly, cutting generous slices of cake for everyone. Candace's smile was tight enough to crack glass. "Oh, you know how it is, just some last-minute coordination issues. Nothing we can't handle." "Of course not. You're both so capable. Though if you need any suggestions about managing vendor relationships, I did organize quite a few large events during my years in education. Sometimes the old-fashioned approaches work better than modern business practices." The look David and Candace exchanged was priceless, the first glimmer of recognition that perhaps their problems weren't entirely coincidental. That evening, I sat in Charles's study with my notebook, adding up the financial pressure that was building. Between the credit reviews, the demand for advance payments, and the cash flow problems from her boutique, Candace was facing a perfect storm of financial stress just 3 weeks before the wedding. But the most satisfying moment came Monday morning, when Margaret called with the latest gossip from her bridge club. "Evelyn, you won't believe what I heard yesterday. Apparently, Candace has been calling around town, trying to find out if anyone knows why all her vendors are suddenly changing their payment terms. She's convinced someone is deliberately interfering with her wedding plans." "How interesting," I murmured. "I can't imagine why she would think that." "Well, the truly delicious part is that she mentioned to someone at the country club that she's starting to wonder if she's somehow offended an influential family member without realizing it." I smiled, watching a cardinal build its nest in the dogwood tree Charles had planted for our silver anniversary. "Sometimes," I said to Margaret, "people create their own problems by forgetting that actions have consequences. The remarkable thing is how often those consequences seem to arrive just when they're needed most." That afternoon I made one final call to the society editor at the Savannah Morning News, mentioning that I'd heard the Telfair Museum's summer charity gala had moved to the same weekend as a family wedding. How wonderful it would be to see which event would draw the most prominent members of Savannah society. As I hung up the phone, I wrote one last entry in my notebook. Phase 1 complete. Time to see how they handle real pressure. There's a particular satisfaction that comes from watching carefully laid plans unfold exactly as intended. It's the same feeling I used to get when a struggling student suddenly grasped a difficult concept, or when a behavioral problem child finally learned the consequences of their actions. By the second week of July, the chickens were coming home to roost in spectacular fashion. The first crack in Candace's composure came on a Tuesday morning. I was deadheading roses in my front garden when my neighbor Mrs. Chen mentioned seeing a very upset young woman sitting in a car outside my house for nearly 20 minutes the evening before, apparently working up the courage to knock on my door but ultimately driving away. "Looked like your daughter-in-law, dear. Is everything all right?" I continued snipping spent blooms, keeping my expression neutral. "Oh, you know how stressful wedding planning can be. I'm sure she's just overwhelmed with all the details." What Mrs. Chen didn't know was that I'd watched the entire episode from my living room window, sipping tea and observing Candace's internal struggle through the windshield of her BMW. She'd sat there checking her phone, running her hands through her hair, and twice actually getting out of the car before losing her nerve and returning to the driver's seat. The reason for her agitation became clear Wednesday morning, when Bobby Kane called with an update on the financial pressure I'd been applying. "Mrs. Harper, I thought you should know that the credit review process has revealed some interesting discrepancies in the boutique's financial statements. Nothing illegal, mind you, but enough inconsistencies to require additional documentation before any credit facilities can be renewed." "What sort of discrepancies, Bobby?" "Inventory valuations that don't match insurance records, revenue projections that seem overly optimistic, given seasonal patterns, and expenses that suggest cash flow problems dating back several months. The kind of things that make lenders nervous about extending additional credit." I made appropriate concerned noises, while mentally noting that Candace's financial house of cards was proving even more precarious than I'd anticipated. "How long might these reviews take to resolve?" "Well, that depends on how quickly she can provide the requested documentation. Could be days, could be weeks. In the meantime, her existing line of credit remains frozen pending clarification." That same afternoon, Lila Brennan called with news about the floral arrangements. "Evelyn, I'm afraid I had to have a difficult conversation with your daughter-in-law today. Without payment confirmation, I simply can't commit to holding the flowers for the Morrison-Williams wedding. Perishables require cash up front. It's just sound business practice." "Of course, Lila, you have to protect your business interests." How did she take the news? "Not well, I'm afraid. She seemed to think there was some sort of conspiracy among local vendors. Asked if I'd been talking to other suppliers about her account status. I assured her that wasn't the case, but she seemed quite convinced that someone was deliberately interfering with her arrangements." The pieces were falling into place beautifully. By Thursday, I'd received similar reports from Jenny Morrison about the DJ services, Sandra Mitchell about the catering, and even Patricia Wells, who'd heard through museum connections that the photography package was in jeopardy due to payment concerns. But the most delicious development came Friday evening, when David arrived at my house unannounced, looking haggard and desperate in a way that reminded me of his teenage years, when he'd gotten in trouble and needed maternal wisdom. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I set down my book and gave him my full attention, the same calm focus I'd used during hundreds of parent conferences over the years. "Of course, honey. What's troubling you?" "Candace is convinced that someone in the family is sabotaging the wedding. She thinks it's too much of a coincidence that every single vendor is suddenly demanding payment up front, all at the same time her business credit gets frozen. She specifically mentioned your name." I raised my eyebrows in genuine surprise. "My name, David. What possible reason would I have to interfere with Bethany's wedding? I barely know the girl, and I certainly don't have any influence over business credit decisions or vendor payment policies." I know. That's what I told her. "But she's really stressed, Mom. The wedding is in 2 weeks, and she's looking at maybe $15,000 in cash that she doesn't have readily available. Her boutique's been struggling more than she's admitted, and without the credit line, she can't bridge the gap." I leaned forward with maternal concern. "Oh honey, that does sound stressful. Have you considered that maybe this is just one of those unfortunate coincidences that happen sometimes? Small businesses are being very careful these days, and credit reviews happen all the time. Perhaps it's not personal, just bad timing." David ran his hands through his hair. "Maybe. But Mom, I have to ask. Are you upset about not being invited to the wedding? Because if you are, we can fix that. Candace was just trying to keep costs down, and she thought you might not enjoy the kind of party they were planning." There it was. The first crack in their united front, the first hint that they were beginning to understand the scope of their miscalculation. "David," I said gently, "I'm 82 years old. I've attended weddings ranging from simple church ceremonies to elaborate society events. I've danced at receptions, cried during ceremonies, and helped clean up afterwards. The idea that I wouldn't enjoy celebrating family happiness is rather insulting, don't you think?" He had the grace to look ashamed. "You're right. I'm sorry, Mom. We handled that badly. But right now I'm more worried about whether we can salvage this wedding at all." Bethany's family has already made travel arrangements. Her dress is being altered. The venue is booked. If we can't secure the vendors, what about asking Bethany's family for help? Surely they could assist with the financial shortfall. They're already stretched thin from travel expenses and their own contributions. And honestly, Mom, Candace has been so proud of being able to host this wedding herself that asking for help would be humiliating. Humiliating. The same humiliation I'd felt sitting in my garden, realizing I'd been dismissed as too old to matter. The same humiliation Marlene had experienced, being categorized as the old crowd. The irony was almost too perfect. Well, I said carefully, I suppose she'll have to decide what's more important, her pride or her sister's wedding. After David left, I sat in the gathering dusk, listening to the sounds of the city I'd called home for over 6 decades. Somewhere across town, Candace was probably lying awake calculating dollars and cents, trying to figure out how to solve a puzzle that had no solution as long as I held the key pieces. My phone rang just before 9 o'clock. Margaret's voice was practically vibrating with excitement. Evelyn, you have to hear this. I just got off the phone with Susan Wright. You know she works at the country club where Candace goes for lunch sometimes. Apparently, Candace was there this afternoon, crying into her salad and telling anyone who would listen that someone is deliberately destroying her sister's wedding. How dramatic, I murmured. The best part is that she's convinced it's someone with real influence in the community, someone with connections to multiple businesses. She actually used the phrase old money power play. Can you imagine? I smiled in the darkness. Old money power play. If only she knew how accurate that description really was, and how little she understood about the true nature of power in a community like Savannah. Margaret, I said, sometimes people create their own storms and then wonder why it's raining. That night, I made one final notation in my notebook. Phase 2 complete, the foundation is cracking, time to see if they're ready to negotiate. The Saturday before Bethany's wedding dawned gray and humid, with the kind of oppressive heat that makes Spanish moss droop like funeral curtains. I woke at my usual 5:30 and made coffee in the kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of family breakfasts over the decades, listening to the sounds of a city that was slowly acknowledging the approaching storm, both meteorological and metaphorical. My phone had been ringing since 7 o'clock the night before, but I'd let every call go to voicemail. David's voice, increasingly desperate. Candace's voice, tight with barely controlled panic. Even a message from Bethany herself, the bride-to-be, asking if I knew why all the wedding vendors were having problems at the same time. But the most interesting call had come from someone I hadn't heard from in months. Charles Mitchell, who ran the Morrison Center where the reception was scheduled to take place. Charles had been one of my most challenging students back in 1983. A boy with anger issues and a difficult home situation who'd found direction through the structure I'd provided in my classroom. Mrs. Harper, his voicemail had said, I heard through the grapevine that you might have some concerns about tomorrow's event at our facility. I wanted you to know that we're committed to making sure everything goes smoothly, but we do need to confirm final payment by noon today. Professional courtesy and all that. Professional courtesy. The kind of consideration that gets extended when you've spent 43 years investing in your community's future, building relationships that span generations. The kind of courtesy that Candace and David had assumed would always be there, even as they systematically excluded me from family life. I dressed carefully for the day ahead, choosing a navy blue dress with a subtle pearl pattern that Charles had always said brought out my eyes. Today wasn't about hiding or pretending to be smaller than I was. Today was about stepping fully into the role I'd earned through 6 decades of community service, child-rearing, and strategic thinking. At 9 o'clock, I called Bobby Kane at his home number, a privilege earned through years of mutual respect and shared history. Bobby, I suspect I'm going to receive some visitors today. People who want to discuss financial arrangements and family relationships. I want to make sure I handle these conversations appropriately. What kind of guidance are you looking for, Mrs. Harper? I want to be fair, but not foolish, generous but not taken for granted, and I want to make sure that any agreements we reach include appropriate acknowledgments of past contributions and future expectations. Bobby was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear him organizing legal concepts in his mind. Would you like me to draft some preliminary terms? Nothing binding, just a framework for discussion that protects your interests while providing potential solutions. That would be very helpful, Bobby. And could you have those documents ready by this afternoon? I have a feeling today is going to be a day for clear conversations. At 10:15, Candace's BMW pulled into my driveway. I watched from the living room window as she sat in the car for several minutes, much as she had earlier in the week, working up courage for a conversation she'd never imagined having to have. When she finally walked up my front path, her usual confident stride was replaced by the careful steps of someone walking on uncertain ground. I answered the door before she could knock, greeting her with the same pleasant smile I'd worn through months of subtle dismissal and outright exclusion. "Candace, dear, how lovely to see you. Please come in." She followed me to the living room where Charles and I had entertained hundreds of guests over the years, where we'd celebrated holidays and birthdays, where I'd comforted crying children and counseled worried parents. The room itself seemed to radiate decades of family history, making Candace's current position even more uncomfortable. "Mama Evelyn," she began, then stopped, seeming to realize that the casual endearment might not be appropriate for the conversation she'd come to have. "Mrs. Harper, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to please be honest with me." I settled into Charles's old wingback chair, the position of authority in our living room, and gave her my full attention. "Of course, dear. What's troubling you? Are you behind what's happening with the wedding vendors? Because if you are, I need to understand why, and I need to know what it's going to take to fix this situation." The directness surprised me. I'd expected more circling, more attempts to maintain plausible deniability, but desperation, I'd learned from years of dealing with teenagers in crisis, often strips away pretense and forces people to confront reality. "Candace, I think you're giving me credit for far more influence than an 82-year-old retired teacher could possibly have. What exactly do you think I've done?" "I think you've used your connections in this community to pressure every vendor we've hired. I think you've somehow triggered the credit review that's frozen my business line, and I think you did it because we didn't invite you to Bethany's wedding." I leaned back in the chair, considering her words. "Those are some very serious accusations, dear. Let me ask you something in return. If I did have that kind of influence in this community, what would that tell you about the wisdom of excluding me from family celebrations?" Her face flushed, but to her credit, she held my gaze. "It would tell me that I made a mistake, a serious mistake." "And what about your comment that I was too old to understand the kind of wedding you were planning? That I would slow everything down and wouldn't fit the aesthetic you wanted?" She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "You heard that conversation." I did, along with several other comments about the old crowd and how elderly people just don't understand modern celebrations. "Tell me, Candace," looking around this room, at the life Charles and I built, at the relationships we cultivated, at the community standing we earned, do I seem like someone who wouldn't understand elegance or sophisticated entertaining? For the first time since I'd known her, Candace looked genuinely ashamed. "No, ma'am, you don't." "And my friend Marlene, who taught music at the university for 30 years and has attended more cultural events than you could count, is she part of an old crowds that wouldn't appreciate beautiful celebrations?" "No, ma'am." We sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, I could hear the gardener working on Mrs. Patterson's yard next door, the normal sounds of a Saturday morning in a neighborhood where I'd been a respected member for over 60 years. "What do you need from me, Candace?" "I need the credit review to be resolved so I can access my business line of credit. I need vendors to return to their original payment terms, and I need to know that no other complications will arise before tomorrow's wedding." "And what are you prepared to offer in return?" "An apology. A sincere public apology for how we've treated you, and an invitation to the wedding, of course." I smiled, but it wasn't a particularly warm expression. "Candace, dear, you seem to think this is a simple misunderstanding that can be fixed with an apology and a last-minute invitation, but what you're really asking me to do is solve financial problems that I had nothing to do with creating, using influence that you claim I shouldn't have, to benefit a celebration that you specifically decided I was too old and irrelevant to attend." She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand. "I'm not finished. What you've learned over the past 2 weeks is something I thought you already understood. In a community like Savannah, relationships matter, respect matters. And the people you dismiss as irrelevant may be the very people whose support makes your success possible. I leaned forward, meeting her eyes directly. So here's what's going to happen, dear. You're going to go home and think very carefully about what kind of relationship you want to have with me going forward. Not just for tomorrow's wedding, but for the years ahead. Because this conversation isn't really about vendor payments or credit reviews. It's about whether you understand who you're dealing with and whether you're prepared to act accordingly. Candace sat frozen, clearly not having expected to be dismissed without a resolution, but the wedding is tomorrow. Yes, it is, which means you have exactly 18 hours to decide what matters more, your pride or your sister's happiness. After she left, I called Bobby Kane and asked him to expedite those documents we'd discussed, because one way or another, tomorrow was going to be a day for new understandings. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline beauty that makes Savannah look like a movie set designed to showcase Southern elegance. I woke before dawn, as I'd done every morning for decades, and made my coffee in the quiet kitchen while watching the sun paint the sky above Forsyth Park in shades of rose and gold. Today was Bethany's wedding day. It was also the day that would determine whether my family had learned anything from the lessons I'd been teaching over the past month. At 6:30, my phone rang. David's voice was strained but determined. "Mom, I need to talk to you. Can I come over?" "I know it's early, but—" "Of course, honey. I'll make extra coffee." He arrived 15 minutes later, looking like he hadn't slept in days. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped him with homework, bandaged scraped knees, and listened to teenage heartbreak, and I waited for him to find his words. "Mom, I need to ask your forgiveness, not just for the wedding invitation, but for forgetting who you are, for letting Candace convince me that you wouldn't fit in, when the truth is that we're the ones who don't deserve to be part of your world." I reached across the table and took his hand, the same hand I'd held when he took his first steps, when he started school, when he got married. "David, I've never doubted your love for me, but respect and love aren't the same thing. You can love someone and still treat them as if they don't matter. I know that now. Candace and I, we talked until 3 in the morning, about the business connections we never knew existed, about the community relationships you've built, about how many people in this city have been shaped by your influence. We realized we don't know half of what you've accomplished, or how much power you actually wield when you choose to use it." I sipped my coffee, studying my son's face. At 45, he was successful in his own right, but sitting in my kitchen, he looked like the little boy who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared him. "And what have you concluded from these revelations? That we've been taking you for granted in the worst possible way. That we treated you like some generic grandmother, instead of recognizing that you're Evelyn Harper, someone who's shaped this community for 60 years, and that we need to make this right, not just for today, but going forward." He pulled an envelope from his pocket, the kind of heavy ivory paper used for formal invitations. "This is for you and Marlene, handwritten by Candace herself, with a personal note of apology. But Mom, I need you to know, this isn't just about solving today's crisis. We want to change how we do things as a family." I opened the envelope and read Candace's carefully penned words. The apology was genuine, specific, and included acknowledgement of the terrible mistake of underestimating my importance to both the family and the community. But more interesting was the final paragraph, which outlined their desire to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of proper respect and appreciation. "This is lovely, honey. But you know that words on paper are just the beginning. Real change requires consistent action over time." "I understand. And Mom, about the wedding itself. I know last-minute invitations aren't ideal, and if you'd prefer not to attend after everything that's happened, we would understand." I smiled at that, because it told me that even now, David didn't fully grasp the situation. "Honey, do you think I've orchestrated this entire educational experience just to miss the final scene? Of course I'm attending the wedding. In fact, I've had my dress picked out for weeks." After David left, I called Marlene to share the news and confirm that she'd also received a personal invitation and apology. Her laughter was rich with appreciation for the delicious irony of the situation. "Evelyn, you've outdone yourself. Those children thought they were dealing with a sweet grandmother, and instead they discovered they'd awakened Scarlett O'Hara with a PhD in strategic warfare." "Oh, Marlene, I prefer to think of it as applied educational psychology. sometimes the most important lessons require the most dramatic teaching methods. At 10 o'clock, I called Bobby Kane with instructions to release the credit holds and restore normal business relationships with all affected vendors. Within an hour, I'd received grateful calls from florists, caterers, photographers, and musicians, all confirming that the Morrison-Williams wedding would proceed as planned. But the most satisfying call came from Lila Brennan at the flower shop. "Evelyn, I don't know what kind of magic you worked, but that young woman who was so difficult earlier this week just called to thank me for my patience and to confirm that payment would be processed immediately. She also asked if I might have time to create a special corsage for someone she described as a very important family member who would be attending after all." I spent the afternoon preparing for the wedding with the same care I'd devoted to important social events throughout my adult life. The dress I'd chosen was elegant navy silk that Charles had always said made me look regal, paired with pearls he'd given me for our silver anniversary and shoes that would allow me to dance if the opportunity arose. At 4 o'clock, Marlene arrived in her own finery, a gorgeous rose-colored suit that complemented her silver hair beautifully. We examined ourselves in my bedroom mirror, two women in their 80s who'd been written off as irrelevant, but had proven that experience and connections were more powerful than youth and assumptions. "Ready to make our grand entrance?" Marlene asked. "Oh, darling," I replied, adjusting my pearls one final time. "We're not making an entrance, we're making a statement." The drive to the mansion on Forsyth Park took us through the heart of historic Savannah, past landmarks and locations that held decades of memories. This was our city, the community we'd helped shape, the society where our names carried weight, earned through years of service and contribution. As we pulled into the wedding venue, I could see guests arriving in their Sunday best, the kind of elegant gathering that Candace had assumed I wouldn't understand or appreciate. Spanish moss draped the oak trees like nature's own decorations, and the late afternoon light painted everything in golden tones that photographers would spend hours trying to recreate. "Evelyn," Marlene said as we walked toward the entrance, "I have to ask, are you planning any more surprises for today?" I smiled, feeling more alive and powerful than I had in months. "Oh, honey, today isn't about surprises. Today is about taking my rightful place in this family and making sure everyone remembers exactly who they're dealing with." As we approached the venue entrance, I could see Candace near the door, greeting guests with nervous energy. When she spotted us, her entire demeanor changed, shoulders straightening, smile becoming genuine, posture shifting from defensive to welcoming. She approached us with the same respect she might show to visiting dignitaries, which, I suppose, we were. "Mrs. Harper, Mrs. Patterson, thank you so much for being here. You look absolutely beautiful, and I can't tell you how much it means to have you as part of this celebration." I accepted her greeting with gracious warmth. "Candace, dear, it's a lovely wedding. Bethany must be so happy to have such a wonderful sister to organize everything so beautifully." As we entered the reception area, I noticed heads turning, whispered conversations, the subtle recognition that Evelyn Harper had arrived and was taking her place at the family table, not as an afterthought or a last-minute addition, but as the matriarch she'd always been. The game was over, the lessons had been learned, and the wedding was just beginning. The wedding ceremony itself was everything Candace had promised it would be: elegant, sophisticated, and beautifully executed. The string quartet played Pachelbel's canon as Bethany walked down an aisle lined with magnolia blossoms and white roses, her dress a vision of Southern romance that would have made even the most cynical observer misty-eyed. But as I sat in the front row where family matriarchs belong, I was thinking about more than just the lovely ceremony unfolding before us. I was thinking about power, respect, and the subtle ways that both can be exercised in a community where relationships matter more than money and where memory extends back through generations of shared history. During the cocktail hour, something remarkable happened. One by one, guests began approaching our table, not just to say hello, but to pay genuine respects to Marlene and me as honored members of the family. These weren't perfunctory social pleasantries, but meaningful conversations with people who understood exactly who we were and what we represented. "Mrs. Harper," said Judge Patricia Crawford, whose confirmation I'd supported 20 years earlier, "it's so wonderful to see you here. Candace was just telling me how instrumental you've been in helping plan this beautiful celebration." I smiled graciously while noting Candace's creative revision of recent history. How kind of her to say so. It's always a pleasure to be part of family milestones. Dr. Richard Mason, whose medical practice had benefited from referrals I'd made over the years, stopped to chat about his memories of the community health fairs I'd organized as a teacher. City Councilwoman Sarah Chen mentioned the literacy programs I'd helped establish that were still serving children today. With each conversation, I could see Candace and David beginning to understand something they'd never fully grasped before, that my connections in this community weren't just social pleasantries or nostalgic remnants of a teaching career. They were active, ongoing relationships with people who held real influence in business, politics, and society. But the most telling moment came when Mayor Harrison approached our table with his wife, both beaming with genuine warmth. "Evelyn, how wonderful to see you looking so radiant. And Marlene, that color is perfect on you. I hope you both know how much the city values your decades of service to our community." He pulled up a chair, settling in for a real conversation rather than a brief social exchange. "Evelyn, I've been meaning to call you about the new Cultural District initiative. We're forming an advisory committee of long-term residents who understand Savannah's character, and your name was the first one mentioned. Would you be interested in participating?" "I'd be honored, Mayor Harrison. You know how passionate I am about preserving Savannah's unique character while supporting thoughtful growth." As he outlined the scope of the project, millions of dollars in development, partnerships with major cultural institutions, decisions that would shape the city for decades, I was aware of Candace listening to every word with growing recognition of just how far her assumptions had been from reality. When the mayor excused himself to circulate among other guests, Candace leaned over with an expression I'd never seen before, not just respect, but something approaching awe. "Mama Evelyn, I had no idea you were involved in city planning initiatives. David never mentioned." "Oh, honey, David doesn't know about most of my community commitments. Why would he? They're just part of what I do, not subjects for family dinner conversation." During dinner, I found myself holding court at our table like the family matriarch I'd always been but had been prevented from being. Stories flowed naturally, memories of Savannah's development over the decades, connections between current events and historical patterns, insights that can only come from 60 years of active participation in a community's growth. Bethany, the bride herself, spent more time at our table than anywhere else, fascinated by stories of old Savannah that put her new married life into historical context. Her new husband, Marcus, was equally engaged, asking thoughtful questions about business development and political changes he'd only heard about secondhand. "Mrs. Harper," Marcus said as we shared wedding cake, "Bethany told me you were a high school principal, but she didn't mention you were basically a founding mother of modern Savannah." I laughed at that. "Not founding, dear, just participating. When you stay in one place long enough and care enough to get involved, you become part of the infrastructure whether you plan to or not." But the evening's most satisfying moment came during the dancing portion of the reception. The jazz band Candace had hired was excellent, playing a mix of contemporary pieces and classic standards that appealed to multiple generations. When they began playing "The Way You Look Tonight," I felt a familiar pang of missing Charles, who'd been my dancing partner for 47 years. David appeared at my elbow, extending his hand with a smile that reminded me of the boy he'd been before life complicated our relationship. "Mom, would you dance with me? I know I can't replace Dad, but I'd love to have at least one dance with the most elegant lady in the room." As we moved on to the dance floor, I was aware of other guests watching, not with the polite attention given to obligatory family moments, but with genuine appreciation for the grace and dignity we represented. Several couples joined us, creating a scene of intergenerational celebration that probably looked exactly like what Candace had originally envisioned, before she'd decided that people my age wouldn't understand sophisticated entertaining. "Mom," David said as we danced, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a promise that things will be different going forward. Not just including you in family events, but actually consulting you about decisions that affect all of us. I realize now that we've been operating without the benefit of your experience and connections, and that's been our loss." "David, I don't need to be consulted about everything, but I do need to be respected for who I am and what I've contributed to this family and community. There's a difference between honoring your elders and actually understanding their value." As the song ended, The band leader made an announcement that surprised everyone, including me. Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue with our evening of celebration, the bride has asked me to recognize some very special family members whose presence makes this occasion even more meaningful. Would Mrs. Evelyn Harper and Mrs. Marlene Patterson please come forward?